each generation, the guns got bigger, as if that's who defined what a man was. Working with men to understand that you're doing yourself a disservice. You're painting yourself into a box that is an illusion.
Unforgiveness. Well, living in unforgiveness, it's been said, is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die. Well, it's unsustainable. It's bondage. It can keep us and hold us back from really, truly living in progress as a leader. And I've invited an expert in this area, Lisa Jones, who works for the St. Louis County Prosecuting Attorney's Office and is the program manager for the Victims Unit. No better source than someone who has dealt with this situation time and time again in the most egregious of ways. Can't wait for you to listen in. I'm Dr. Nate Sala, and this is A Call to Leadership. Lisa, so good to have you on the show today. We've been working on getting you here, and I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Nate. I'm happy to be here.
Yes, we've had conversations around what you do and how important and relevant it is to leadership. And of course, you know, I'm a diehard fan of leadership, but also moving from leadership in crisis to leadership in triumph and victory. And you've been in the trenches working for the St. Louis County Prosecutor's Office. Tell us about your role and how you got there.
Sure. Well, right now I head up the Victim Service Division of the Prosecutor's Office. So our role, I head a team of victim advocates and I supervise them. In addition, I also have maintained a caseload. So I primarily work with families where there has been a homicide. I've been with the office, it'll be 32 years in December. I started as their caseworker many years ago, working with adult sexual assault survivors, child sexual abuse survivors, and then I also kept the homicide cases back then. And when I moved up to management, not that I didn't enjoy supervising other advocates, but I really missed the interaction, the one-on-one that I got working with victims, so I kept that caseload of homicide cases.
And that's some heavy stuff that you deal with.
It is. It is. We are working with victims at the worst possible moment of their life when they've been horrifically victimized by other human beings. And you're taking them through a system that is not set up to protect the rights of victims, because the criminal justice system is set up to make sure that constitutionally people who are accused of crimes have their constitutional rights protected. And although victims do have a Victims' Rights Amendment, if you're a victim going through the system, you feel like it's completely set up to protect the rights of the defendant. And in a certain sense, that is correct. And it has to be that way because our Constitution of the United States of America protects all of us as citizens, that if we're ever accused of a crime, we have the right to make sure that our rights are protected.
Yeah. And when you have a victim come in, clearly there's already there's no prosecution necessary to determine they're a victim.
Correct.
They're already in a state that's been compromised. And your role and your team's role is to do what for them?
So it's actually twofold. One, and primarily, most importantly, our role is to make sure that victims understand what their rights are as they go through the system. And as I mentioned, there is a Victims' Rights Amendment in Missouri, as well as the Victims' Rights Amendment in all 50 states. And that affords victims certain rights to be informed of the charges, rights to appear in court whenever the defendant is present in court, a right to be heard. So we want to make sure, first and foremost, that our victims understand what their rights are, that our victims are being referred to appropriate referrals in the community, whether it's for housing, support services, counseling, to deal with their victimization. And then also equally important is to make sure that prosecutors and judges remember that victims have rights in the system, and to make sure that things are not happening on cases without victims being informed of what's going on.
Yeah. You see the whole range, I'm sure. I mean, 32 years, you've seen it all. Mm-hmm. Walk our listeners through the mindset of a victim. I mean, what are they feeling? What are you doing to help them along their journey? Because, and I say that, let me preface it. This is, this tough stuff is all around us. We don't hear so much about it because it's behind closed doors.
But the reality is, and tell me if you agree or disagree, is that we're all part of the solution if we can get involved in and at least have empathy for people that have been in these dire situations, because we probably encounter them more than we know.
Correct. Here's the interesting thing that I find is that all of us, no matter what our age and what generation, what our background is, for the most part as human beings, we are really raised in what I call a just world theory. And what I mean by that is if you are respectful to me, the theory is that I'm going to be respectful back to you. And being a crime victim, honestly, blows that all to hell because it's arbitrary, it's sudden, it's unexpected, especially when it is a stranger who commits a crime. Like, for example, I walk to the car and someone pulls up next to me with a gun and carjacks me. There's no rhyme or reason why that would happen. So it really blows that just world theory out of the water for victims, and it makes you feel very out of control. Now, let's compare that to I'm in a relationship. I meet someone, I fall in love with that person. I don't expect that person is ever going to start to be abusive to me. So that's a different level of out of control. It's like, what is happening that this person who was supposed to love, honor, and respect me is now being disrespectful, verbally abusive, and potentially physically abusive? So most victims, they start to think, well, what did I do that caused this to happen? Because I think all of us as human beings want to believe that we have some semblance of control out of our lives. And for the most part, we do, except when it comes to victimization, because the person who has the power and control is the perpetrator. They are the ones that know when they're going to victimize their victim and how that's going to look. And that's really frightening for victims. And so part of your role as a victim advocate, I believe, is helping individuals come to terms with their powerlessness. And victims were powerless over their victimization, and to a certain extent, they're powerless over how the case is going to proceed through the criminal justice system. And so that's a really unique perspective for most human beings to be in.
Well said. Yeah. I mean, I just, one of our episodes on the show is all about power and influence. And I go through this list of power sources or power bases, and one of them is coercive power, the power to punish, the power to hurt. And in some contexts, coercive power, it sounds so bad, but in some contexts, it's simply, maybe it's a termination of employment or something like that. In other cases, it's what you deal with. These are life altering. And I wonder how this system, you talk about the powerlessness in the system, even justice isn't going to help in some ways, right? I mean, there's still going to be pain.
Correct.
That continues on.
So one of the things that just personally, and I talk about this a lot with some of the family members on my cases, when someone you love has been murdered, for example, let's use that as an example, whether it's my child, my spouse, a parent, in theory, intellectually, that person going away to prison for the rest of their life feels like that's going to make you feel better. But in reality, the only thing that you really want is the person you love to come walking back in the door. Now, being held accountable absolutely helps. But healing from victimization is not contingent on someone going to prison. Healing, in my opinion, is integrating the crime, the loss into your life and figuring out a way to continue to move forward. And that's really, I believe, a goal for any of us, whether it's divorce, whether it's the loss of a job, whether it's being a crime victim, whether it's any disappointment on that full range, that spectrum of disappointment. Severe, obviously, being a victim of a major type of crime. But the goal is, how do I integrate that loss into my life and move forward? Because I can't crawl into the grave with the person that was murdered. That's not going to solve anything for me. For a lot of my victims' families, they have other children. They have other relatives that are dependent on them. And the process of grieving is integration into your life and continuing to move forward. And that's a tall task, and it is not contingent on the criminal justice system. And that's a hard concept for a lot of families to understand and grasp.
Yeah. Is there a process that you see in grasping that? Is there a timeline? Is it some people just never reach there? Some people are quicker than others? I mean, what are some of the things that you see in terms of how people can cope and move forward?
That's a great question. And I think it's dependent on so many factors, whether it is something like homicide or even something as simple as my house being burglarized. A lot of it, I think, has to do with what kind of support do we have within the family? Some of it is access to mental health, which, that could be a whole separate podcast, in that, in this country alone, mental health issues are not fully addressed, and we don't have appropriate funding, especially for people from a lower economic standard of living. But I also think that there are some people who come from a faith-based perspective, somebody who is connected to a church, no matter what your religious affiliation. I think for some families, that can be a huge support in integrating this kind of loss into their life. The flip of the coin, though, honestly, Nate, is that can sometimes be a trigger point for why did this happen? Why my faith did not help me through this? Why do I feel abandoned by my higher power? So that can bring a challenge for some people that just is an extra layer that they have to look at and deal with.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the mental health aspect and the expectations we have, and such a disparage in how we even interpret mental health in the United States. We spend so much time focused on our physical well-being, and there's a place for that, and that's important. But what do we do when we, in other episodes, people would hear me talk about this as well. What do we do when we hear someone talk about their new workout regime, or they got a personal trainer? We encourage them and we support them. But then when they say, well, I got a counselor to help me with my mental, my spiritual, or my emotional help, and then we say, oh, I'm so sorry. It's a completely different response.
It totally is. And it's interesting to me that, I was a therapist before I came into working in the prosecutor's office. So I spent time both working, for example, in chemical dependency in an inpatient program and an outpatient program, and then had a small private practice after that. But what's interesting to me is that it for some groups of people, mental health is a sign of weakness. And honestly, recognizing that I'm struggling with an issue is actually the highest form of strength. And the example that you just used is so critical to me, because you're right. If somebody is overweight and they get on a health plan and they're starting to lose weight, everybody thinks that's great. And it is, because you're reducing heart disease, you're reducing stress in your life. That's fabulous. But if someone says, I'm really struggling with depression, everybody somehow thinks that, oh my God, you're struggling with depression. It should be viewed in the exact same context.
Yeah. And I mean, you would consider, okay, well, an extreme case of, possible suicidal thoughts and extreme depression and things like that. And okay, so that might be an extreme side of it, but even on the side of mental well-being, right? So like I think about, we talked before we came on air about eating healthy, right? Well, there's a need for that because our bodies need us to give it good fuel, and our minds do as well. And that goes, and the experts, the counselors, are the ones who will help us achieve that. And so I wonder how many people are missing out their entire lives on expert help to learn how to lead our lives in a more fruitful way with so many burdens and roadblocks. And so my philosophy is everybody needs counseling.
Yes, I would agree. There are a lot of people that would benefit from counseling. Yeah. And I'll give you a great example. I had a conversation just earlier this week with a mother of a homicide case, and she's struggling. And she went to see her doctor, and he had suggested seeing a therapist and possibly going on a mild antidepressant to help her. And she was very opposed to that. And so I said to her, okay, so I'm wondering if you went to get a mammogram and the doctor said to you, there is a lump in your breast, would you do absolutely nothing, or would you see an oncologist? Would you have a lumpectomy? To me, it's the exact same thing. You have a medical professional saying, this is something that can alleviate some pain that's going on in your life right now. You may not be on it for the rest of your life, but for now, why not try something? And, again, a pill is not going to take the pain away, just like counseling is not going to take the pain away. What I encourage people to look at therapy as is that it is an opportunity for you to get tools in a toolbox that will allow you to deal with issues as they arise in your life. I wish that an hour counseling session would take away all pain. It does not, and it never will. But again, it's teaching you tools that you will be able to use throughout your life. Because whether you are a crime victim, or even if you are a crime victim, that's not the last disappointment or frustration you're going to have in your life. And so why wouldn't we take advantage of tools that are going to help us in the future?
Agreed. Yeah. And it's illumination in a lot of ways. And it's part of the process of learning, and learning is growing. And so, if we're going to lead more fruitful lives and full lives, we want to continue to add those tools to our lives. And it sounds so basic, but it's so essential. And I was thinking just yesterday, if we use the same analogy on exercise, I went to the gym and I was kind of healing from a little back injury, and I did some back exercises. I'm pretty sure if I had a therapist, quote unquote, right, a physical therapist to help me with this, my physical therapist would have said, Nate, you probably don't want to lift that heavy a weight because you're going to hurt your back again. And so the same contexts apply for the psychological realm that we live in, right? If and it's not necessarily that it's going to mitigate an issue, but it certainly will illuminate the possibilities later. Like, so for example, if you're struggling with depression, especially today with post-pandemic, isolation, existential crises, why are we here? People dying, loved ones and friends dying all around us. And having those conversations with someone who is trained in this area to give you the kind of tools to understand the context more effectively, understand why you feel the way you feel, and perhaps even some steps to take so that you can start to move out of that depression.
I agree with you totally. And the other thing, too, that is interesting about therapy, and I think it for those people who have taken advantage of therapy, one of the other things that comes up is that you also have to put the mirror back on yourself and take responsibility. An example I often use with victims of sexual abuse is, first of all, you did nothing to cause this abuse. The responsibility for why the abuse happened rests with the perpetrator. But what does become our responsibility is, what do we do with that now? Okay? Because a survivor could go for the next 15, 20 years constantly blaming their perpetrator for the abuse. But guess what? You have to take responsibility now for what I do with it, knowing that this happened to me. It is affecting my life. Now I have the responsibility of what am I going to do to deal with my own issues? And that's a tough thing to do in therapy. When you have couples, not even associated with victimization, but you have a husband and wife or two partners who go into marriage counseling, for example, or couples counseling. It's easy to point the finger at the other person and say, well, this person does this person does that. But you also have to turn the lens back on yourself and say, what am I bringing to this relationship? What is my old baggage? How am I affecting my ability to move forward in life? And so, whether it's in a couple, whether I'm a victim of something, it's triggering things that maybe I didn't even know existed. And now I have to take the responsibility to look at, what am I bringing to this picture? And what are these obstacles that I'm placing in front of myself? And let's face it, none of us wants to do that. None of us wants to turn and open that closet and see all of our emotional baggage that's going to fall out. And so I understand people's reluctance to see a counselor. Believe me, I get it. But the benefits far outweigh anything that you're afraid of looking at.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm so glad you brought it up. I'm a huge fan of taking responsibility and even just breaking down the word, able to respond.
Yes.
Right? Responsibility. So it's not that we can control all of the circumstances that come into our purview and affect us. But we can control, I've heard it said like this, is our attitude. It's a bitter pill to swallow, because sometimes what do? We hold on to the pain. We hold on to the anger, the bitterness. And I've heard it said like this, is that, having unforgiveness or having that bitterness is like swallowing poison and expecting your enemy to die.
Yes.
It's affecting you more than anyone. And it's prohibiting us from really having, a profitable life, if you will, right? It's full of all kinds of gain in our lives, because we're anchored down by this weight, this burden. And in some ways, have you seen that it's sometimes people hold on to it?
Absolutely. It's not just holding on to the pain, but it's what you said a moment ago. For many people, it's holding on to the anger. And I often have some really compelling and interesting conversations with some of my families who talk to me about, I'm struggling with forgiveness. I don't know if I can forgive. And because they're still angry at the person who committed the crime. And over the years, I've really sort of pondered this and thought about this. And the way I look at it is being able to forgive is not saying, I don't want that person held accountable. They're not mutually exclusive. And so for some of the people that I work with on my cases, it's very important to them to reach forgiveness, because they come from a faith-based perspective where that's very critical to them. And they've also worked through the process of understanding, I can forgive and yet still want this person held accountable, that's not mutually exclusive. And so that's an important piece for them. And many of them will say to me, I forgive because I want to be forgiven. And honestly, I'm so blown away by their grace and dignity, because quite honestly, I don't know if I would be at that place if I were in their position. It's a really awe-inspiring moment for me when I see someone say that at a sentencing hearing, and they're truthful. They forgive the person who has harmed them the most. It blows me away.
Yeah. And as you're saying it, I see this release, like this liberation that the victim has. I was thinking about it just yesterday. It's interesting you brought this up. If something, God forbid, happened to a loved one through a victimization, how would I react? Would I be able to participate in that same level of grace and forgiveness? And again, it's not, as you said, it doesn't make it right what happened. It doesn't it doesn't remove accountability, as you said. It doesn't keep you from putting up healthy boundaries as are needed in the future. But what it does is it releases the burden of carrying that weight of anger, of bitterness, and of hatred in some ways. And I know I've suffered with it. I come from a family of folks who sometimes will hold on to a grudge for a long, long time. I remember years ago, my dad and my uncle had some kind of an argument in the early 70s about a refrigerator. And so the fridge I think it was the price of the fridge, right? It was maybe $200. My dad thought it was maybe $400, my uncle. So they had this argument about the fridge, and my dad held a grudge against my uncle forever until, it was his sister was my uncle's wife until she passed away. And they didn't see each other again until the funeral. And I thought to myself, man, you held on to that for 20 plus years, and you didn't even get to see your sister, who you loved dearly, until it was time to bury her. Who lost?
Yeah. And, it's interesting because, again, no judgment on the people who hang on to anger and are not ready to release that. Because, again, I understand that as well. And I've said to people, if anger and bitterness would bring your loved one back, I'd jump on the anger train with you. But who is it serving? It's not serving the defendant, because 9 times out of 10, they could care less if you're angry with them. I mean, really, in 30 years, I'm not exaggerating, Nate. I think I have seen remorse from a defendant. I can count it on one hand. Not that they're not remorseful on down the road. I'm not judging defendants, but at the point where we're seeing it, you just don't see it all that often. I have witnessed it, and it has been a very powerful and moving moment for both the victims and the defendants in court. But we have to figure out a way to move through these strong emotions, because they do not serve us as individuals. They don't move us in the direction of recovery. In many ways, they hold us back and only make us miserable. And each individual is going to have to decide how they do that. But your story is great. I think any one of your listeners would be able to recall an incident. I mean, I never knew my grandfather on my dad's side, but I remember family stories of my grandfather and his brother were in business together, and they got in a fight over something simple. And just like the example you gave, they didn't talk for 25, 30 years. I only have one sister. I can't imagine not talking to her, since I talk to her on a daily basis. And maybe it's a product of getting older. I look at some of the things that I held a grudge on when I was in my 20s, and I think,
well, and it's a lesson. And I'm so glad you said that. We certainly don't judge the struggle, if you will,
yes,
right, of moving through that, because it is a struggle. But at the same time, it's so helpful to think about what's possible on the other side of freedom. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how it relates, this idea of control. And it's interesting because I wonder how much of the holding on to unforgiveness is a perception of control. In other words, I control that I don't have to let go. I don't have to make this, air quotes, right. Of course, it's not right anyway. But then it gets me to think about, well, if you think about like self-efficacy and the psychological parameters of locus of control, where in the mind of a self-efficacious person, there's these varying degrees of control. So like someone with low self-efficacy versus high self-efficacy, a person with high self-efficacy would believe they have more control over their own behavior, their own motivation, their social environment. And the higher the self-efficacy, the more they believe they can control. And of course, the lower self-efficacy, the less they believe they can control it. And the same works for this construct of locus of control. And so you can generally pick out people who will have a high locus of control versus low. For example, if you're late to an appointment and you say, oh boy, the car wouldn't start, or the traffic was crazy, or the kids were making me late, and all the external reasons why that happened, where the person with maybe a higher locus of control would say, well, I could have got up a little earlier. I could have checked my GPS to see where the traffic lanes were, and really taking more ownership of how I respond, back to your original statement, to all the context and circumstances that are happening around me. And I wonder how that feeds into this idea of working through victimization, working through forgiveness. I mean, have you seen any patterns where people feel, well, I can control the situation in my own mind by not letting that go, but at the same time, maybe it's really not control at all?
It's an illusion of control. That's really what it is. In and of itself, control is not a bad thing. It's how we express control that can create problems in our lives. So like, for example, a parent has to have power and control over their children, or else the kids would be running out into traffic. That's not an abuse of control. But I think control and power become maladaptive to us when we express it in ways that are not helpful. So it's an illusion. What I have found over the years is that accepting that I don't have power and control actually is more freeing. Now, for some people, like for example, a recovering alcoholic, they turn it over to their higher power, and that's a very freeing moment to them. For some of the families that we work with, for some victims, turning that power and control over to their higher power is actually their first step in regaining power, if that makes sense. Understanding that there are things outside of our lives that happen that I don't have to control so tightly. And a trust or faith, if you will, just releases you and actually brings you back so many more benefits. And I have seen that over the years.
Yeah, I would agree. And I've seen that as well. And even in my own life. You said something that triggered a memory of high school. So you wouldn't guess this, but I was a hothead in high school. And I think that there's something happens. My wife was telling me about some kind of a chemical that's released in males once you start to get close to 50 that sort of calms you and testosterone level decreases. But anyway, I had a lot of angst. And so there were other boys in high school who antagonized me. And I always got into fights. And I felt powerful when I got into those fights. But then as I got into my late teens, a light bulb went off and I said, you're actually not the one with power. It's your classmates who are pushing your buttons, who really are holding the power. They're wielding the power because they can control your behavior. And at that point, it was just like, oh, wait a second. Oh, I can actually change that. I can actually stop them from controlling my behavior by not engaging and allowing them to impart their verbal abuse or whatever in a way that causes me to respond with getting to a fight after class.
Right. It's interesting, and I think it's very telling for not just in the American culture, because I think this is worldwide, but certainly for men, there is a cultural influence that relates masculinity with power and control. And so if men don't exert that kind of power and control, in some way, they're not perceived as being masculine. And that really is ridiculous, because all human beings, when they're born, whether born male or female, they have the same capacity for every human emotion. There is no difference, except in our culture, men are raised to believe that emotions like being gentle, being kind, that is not tied to masculinity, which is really ridiculous when you think about it. But from the time you were a little boy and the time that I was born as a female, we were raised differently. So if I was raised to be assertive and strong and powerful, that was perceived for my generation as not being feminine. Whereas if you were raised, to be seen as kind and gentle, you were perceived as not being masculine. And so you have a lot of people buying into that mythology and buying into the myth that if I have to be a man, I have to get into fights. And again, it's a choice that people make. Culture didn't make somebody abusive. The choice to express your anger or my anger is a choice that I make, and I can choose violence. I can choose nonviolence. But the mythology really makes men think that they have to live up to that sense of masculinity. And it's really ridiculous and unfortunate, because it puts men in a box.
It does. And I was in that box for a long time. And it wasn't until really I had, you talk about faith, sort of a faith transition. And I started to realize that, it actually takes more strength to rise above it. And it's so then I started thinking, actually I can have dialogue. And even, in a high aggressive, context and circumstances, like, okay, let's stay cool-headed. Let's be gentle. Let's be kind. Let's have empathy. Wow. It took me thankful for my wife because she taught me a lot of empathy over the years. But why did it have to take getting married and then another 20-year journey, right? Because we're not necessarily, empathy is not in the playbook for males, and I'm glad you brought that up. My mom, single mom, assertive, on her P's and Q's, probably embodied both the masculine and the feminine. And so I never looked at women in a way that was, I guess you would say, culturally appropriate for the time of gender separation in terms of emotions and behaviors. But that's the norm. And you're right. It has put males in a box. And I would imagine even through the justice system. And I don't have the stats in front of me, but I know the stats are remarkably higher that males committing violent crimes over females.
Correct. Yes. And certainly within interpersonal relationships. And that is not to say that women are not capable of being abusive, but the way that we define abuse is behaviors which exert power and control over someone. And in our culture, primarily, men have more privilege than women do, both financially, culturally, over generations, men are just deferred to. But that doesn't mean that women can't be abusive in relationships. And I always make it clear when I'm talking to young people that equality for women is not now we get to be abusive towards men. That's not equality. Equality is really we need to level the playing field by not being abusive to one another. And it's interesting what you said, how the growth that you achieved over the years. It's easy for you and I to sit here at this podcast and talk about how, we don't need to fight back abusively. It's very different when you're the 14-year-old kid being bullied, because I was that same person. I would have eviscerated you with my words if I thought you were bullying somebody. I don't think at age 15, I would have sat there and in my mind thought, how can we resolve this peacefully? It wasn't in my playbook,
Right.
Because I was going to come at you if you were being mean to somebody. So those are the things that we learn. That's what maturity brings to us. And that's what education and being in partnership with the right person teaches us. So it's easy for you and I to sit here today and think of all these things that woulda, shoulda, coulda done when we were kids. Because when you're in the moment, it's hard to think of those things.
Well,
but I
yeah.
really think that that's what we really need to focus on nonviolent conflict resolution. And again, we live in a culture where, especially in the criminal system, masculinity is tied to violence. You can see it. These mass shootings where these young men are walking in with these semi-automatic assault rifles. And those are just those examples. On any day of the week, Nate, there are people who are driving down our streets shooting at one another. Over what? And I have these conversations with the women and the mothers of victims. What is it that is being influenced of our young men that they think that they need to resolve differences with a gun battle? Because I guarantee you, it's not the victims and the perpetrators who are getting shot. It's the innocent people who are sitting on their front porches enjoying a Sunday afternoon that have nothing to do with the argument. They're getting caught in the crossfire. And I don't know what it's going to take for people to wake up and stop this nonsense. It makes me feel very old.
You're hitting on all kinds of cylinders today. That exact situation happened to me back in 1997. So I had my paging and cell phone store in North County, Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri. And I was coming back to my office. It's about 8 o'clock at night, late summer. It was dark. And I was at a stoplight, and there was a Blazer right next to me. And we were both at the light, and then all of a sudden, gunshots. All around whizzing. You hear glass and metal, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to die. And the Blazer slowly crept in the middle of the street, and it was a homicide. And I lived to tell about it, but that was as close to death as I ever wanted to be. because I know the statistics show that, like you just said, I mean, it's everybody else that's getting shot. And fortunately, no one else was on that street. It was quiet, but pretty sure some of those bullets went flying all around that street, and someone else would have likely died too. And that moment resonated with me so much that I thought, wow, how does this happen? To where that's the answer to these problems. And it's of course it's not, but we're caught up. And I grew up in an environment. I grew up on the west side of Chicago and in North St. Louis. So two rough environments. And a lot of my buddies here in St. Louis and in Chicago, they were gangsters. And they were part of gangs, and and the culture of that. And I never joined a gang, but because I saw it, and I thought, well, this is just I was always a little forward thinking, like, okay. Although I did get in trouble with the law because I was just I wasn't forward thinking enough, but not to that extent to where I said, this is like it's a one-way road to nowhere. And I wonder what level of absenteeism in leadership in the home has an influence on that. Now, I grew up, my parents were divorced. My dad stayed in Chicago, and my mom and I and my stepfather moved here to St. Louis. But I mean, I only really had a father relationship. It was sporadic, and it was broken. And my mom was an entrepreneur. She was just trying to do her thing, and she was trying as best she could. But it was really tough. And I wasn't the easiest kid to raise. And I didn't have that great influence. And I made a lot of mistakes because there was no real wisdom and mentorship outside of the little bit that I was getting from my mom and maybe some other family members, but not that true deep investment in this is where your future is going. And how can I help you and invest in you so that you don't live a life that leads to folly and destruction? I mean, how much, and I wonder how much of that you observe in your role where, how, and I don't know how easy it is to respond to that question, but I just want to pose it because I know that there's a responsibility on parents.
There is, and I do, there is a sense of hopelessness, I think, that's out there that year after year, it's sort of like that snowball rolling down the mountain. Because, let's face it, Nate, poverty has existed since the beginning of time. My parents were products of the Depression. They came out of nothing. And yet they achieved a certain level of success. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that, that do not make it easy across the board. There's certainly institutional racism that exists in this country that makes it much easier for a white person to succeed than a person of color. And certainly poverty, lack of education, the breakdown of the family, that absolutely has affected the skyrocketing rates of crime in inner city areas and now bleeding over into suburban areas. So you're absolutely right. It does play a role. I think there's also, and we've talked about this, weaving it in and out throughout this podcast, I also feel like there is a continuum of not taking responsibility that has skyrocketed in this country. Everyone wants to place the blame of boo-hoo me at the feet of someone else, when guess what? I'm responsible for the ridiculous choices that I have made in my life. And would I have made other choices if I was born to affluent people? Possibly, but affluent people make really bad decisions as well. Maybe they're not punished at the same rate, but they make bad decisions as well. And I think that I think we need to start looking at holding people more accountable.
Yeah, it starts with me. Like I said, I did some really stuff. My mom was an immigrant, and even though she was an immigrant and we were poor, there was this sense of ownership that she instilled in me. And I was standing in front of a judge, several judges. I've stood in front of like a judge that took my license away. I had 12 points. And this is long before I even knew about attorneys helping you. And he's like, son, you don't need a license right now. I was like, okay. And then I was standing in front of another judge for just doing dumb stuff. And eventually the light went off. I'm like, you got to take responsibility. If you're going to, you can't blame, the fact that you didn't have, or the fact that, your family, comes from another country, and you can't blame that you didn't have all the tools and all the resources and all the money. What are you going to do? What are you going to do today? Okay, so all of that crazy stuff happened today. What change can you make in your life? And it was right around, I guess, 2000, that I began a brand new journey. And it was really through mentorship. I began surrounding myself with people in my faith walk who had achieved what I desired: wisdom, wholeness, togetherness with family. I was just starting to court and possibly marry my future wife, which we did marry. And I thought, well, what kind of a kid would I want to have? Would I want to have a kid who had the same type of roadblocks as me, or do I want to have a kid who saw that his dad was actually making some differences and changes in his life? And my dad, when I was young, my dad was in prison. I was like, I don't want to be that dad. And back to the choices.
And what you said too, I think really resonates, is the mentorship, because we do have a lot more families in 2022 that are broken than we certainly did in 92, 82, 62. The times have changed, and we can't go backwards. I don't think we're ever going to go back to the nuclear family that we saw, in the Brady Bunch. It's not going to be there. We need to move on and recognize that families are going to take on all different kinds of shapes and sizes. But I do think that mentorship is really important, because like we mentioned, there is a sense of hopelessness for some of these people. And I get it. If you're living in a neighborhood where gunshots every night is just a norm. I mean, we have kids growing up where they hear gunshots every single night. You become desensitized to this. In a certain sense, I wonder if as a culture we're not becoming desensitized to violent crime, because we see it all too often. And so I do think that if we can get some of these youth into really critical mentor programs where they see successful men and women. I had a father of a murder victim say something to me interesting. His son was gunned down, and he said, in my day and age, Lisa, not that this was right, but if I would have had a problem with somebody, we would have gotten into a fist fight. And if I would have won, I would have picked you up and I would have said, let's go to the corner bar and buying you a beer. And he said, I recognize that fighting is fighting. He goes, but today there are no fist fights. You pull out a gun and you kill somebody. And it was interesting because I can't remember the name of the person who created this docuseries or docudrama, but it was called Tough Guys. And it was specific to men and masculinity, and how men and masculinity was tied to guns. And in this documentary, it was interesting because he went back to way back in the 40s to Sam Spade, Humphrey Bogart, had a revolver that was the size of your hand. And as each generation moved forward, you went from a tiny gun, and that, Sam Spade, Humphrey Bogart was seen as a tough guy back then. Flash forward to Dirty Harry and Clint Eastwood, and now all of a sudden it's a .357 and it's a huge gun. Then flash forward to the 70s, and it was Rambo, and he had some massive Gatling gun. And how men and masculinity, each generation, the guns got bigger, as if that's who defined what a man was. And so it was an interesting documentary, and I wish I could remember who did it, because it was brilliant. Because it really talked about how we need to get away from tying masculinity into bigger guns. And again, working with men to understand that you're doing yourself a disservice. You're painting yourself into a box that is an illusion. Yeah. And the illusion is getting you into prison.
Yes. And it's a limitation.
Absolutely. It's a
limitation.
limitation
Of the possibilities of power.
Yes.
back to that conversation around coercive power, right? Because the gun gives you a sense of power. And again, you're right. It's an illusion because you become powerless when you go to prison, when you face consequences.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it was that I went to Catholic schools, and so I can always remember the nun saying, "Did the devil make you do it?" Which, again, of course, that was easy for me to say. Well, of course, sister, I didn't mean to do it that way, but of course I meant to do it that way. I'm the person who was acting. I'm the one that did this. But again, it's that let me dodge responsibility and say, well, boo-hoo, I came from this kind of family. This is what made me do this. Again, it makes, I believe that people who, it didn't make you do it, it made you feel like you had less options, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Certainly poverty, a lack of education, drug-addicted parents, you are not going to have all of the tools in your toolbox to make good decisions. So it certainly plays a factor into why people make bad choices in life, if that makes sense.
Makes total sense. It makes total sense because if you check all the boxes, some of us will be able to check more boxes of having less favorable cards in the deck dealt to us, right? But at some point, when we're children, decisions are made for us. When we're adults, we make our own decisions. At some point, we have to make decisions how we're going to lead our future. And I understand wholeheartedly this mindset, especially with the youth of, well, this is all I know. This is all I can do, because I was there. And it just, running hustles and doing really dumb stuff. It's like, well, I don't know any better. This is the only life I know. And because there's not real, like you said, the mentorship and the leadership to illuminate a better path, illuminate and then eliminate fruitless paths. In fact, we would talk with our son. I heard a pastor say this. He talked about, instead of organizing behavior around right and wrong, because people have different perceptions of what's right and wrong.
Right.
Legal and illegal, because laws change. He said, organize the decisions in your family and your own decisions around wise and foolish, because people generally will agree on what's wisdom and folly. Even someone who is getting ready to commit murder will generally agree that it's probably folly. I'm going to go this route, but it's all I know to do based on the emotions I'm feeling, based on what's happened and whatnot. And so we started having those conversations with our son. And so when he'd backtalk or he'd do something he shouldn't do, I'd say, son, was that wise or foolish? And give him an opportunity. And this is like 3-4 years old. Give him an opportunity to think it out. Say, Dad, that was foolish to do whatever I did. And I'll say, let's try it again. And then we try it again. And I was like, was that wise? Like, yeah, that was wise. And building a framework in his decision-making based on wisdom and folly. And so I say that to say that was mentorship in action based on my own folly in life, because I'd been there and I'm like, man, you don't want to make these decisions, because some of the decisions that I made when I was a youth, I can't change them now. They'll always stick with me. Some of the people I've hurt in the past are just the dumb stuff I've done. And if I can help you to see that path before you even take it, and then recognize by decision making, because I honestly believe, Lisa, that if we can maturely look out into the future and see what are the end consequences for a decision, then we will be more informed on making a wise choice. And sometimes it's not even that we need a mentor. They're great, but like, I used to watch all those movies. I used to watch the Rambo movies, the Goodfellas, all the mobster, the gang movies. And I think that's one of the reasons why I never joined a gang, because I watched Goodfellas, I watched Casino, and I'm like, man, I don't want that end state, like me in a ditch somewhere. I mean, on the west side of Chicago, it's rough. It's rough. But I saw in those movies people being buried alive because of that environment that they were in. I'm like, I don't want that. But I didn't know what I did want because I hadn't seen a better future state.
Well, it's interesting, too, because, there's been a push nationally of something called progressive prosecution. And, for victims, that has a negative connotation because, for some victims, they want this person tossed in jail and they want the key thrown away. what I do really support totally, because about progressive prosecution, some of the programs, and my office is my boss is one of the people who has done some of this, is that it's about stopping the revolving door for prisons. Now, we're not talking about I gun down 10 people and I get to be in a diversion program. But what a lot of these progressive prosecution programs really believe in is getting some of these people who are doing entry-level crimes and getting them into programs where they can get drug treatment, where they can get mentorship, so that if I'm vandalizing a house and I'm doing that because I'm looking for copper to support my drug habit, maybe if I get into a program and treat this drug addiction, I am not 10 years down the road going to be holding you up at gunpoint or holding up a bank at gunpoint and then doing federal time. So it to me, as a therapist and a social worker, those things are critical to me, because you can't just have the revolving door. We have to provide some type of hope, even for the people that commit crimes, so that they look and see, do I have other options? Or else I am going to be in prison for the rest of my life, because the pendulum is going to keep swinging and I'm going to start committing more and more serious crimes that are going to result in me spending the rest of my life in prison, or a good chunk of my life in prison. And I have friends who work on more of the defendant side of the aisle, if you will, in programs that are trying to stop that cycle of going in and out of facilities. And, that's not what I call sexy. Taxpayers don't want to hear about that. They would rather build a bigger prison than provide funding for programs for people in prison. And I've been doing this long enough that we could put a prison on every street corner and it's not going to stop crime until we address the mental health issues, until we provide job training, until we provide things that make people want to choose the wiser road that you talked about. Because I had a case once where this individual was killed, and at the time that his older brother was killed, the younger brother was 5 years old, and he was the cutest little guy. When the trial happened, he came and he couldn't go into the courtroom, so I would sit outside with him, and he was just a precious little guy. So flash forward 15 years later, he's now sitting in court because he got arrested for drugs. And I remember looking at him when I happened to walk into court and seeing him, and he wouldn't make eye contact with me. And I saw his mom sitting in the courtroom. And I remember him saying later, I could have gotten a job at McDonald's, but I was making more money dealing weed on the street corner, and the money was going to help my family. Okay, well, that, in essence, good for you for taking care of your family. Now your mom's going to visit you in prison. She already lost one son to the streets by gun violence, and now she's lost you to prison. I get what you're thinking. I'm supporting my family, but the choices that you made were not the right ones. And so that was years ago. He went to prison for that. And now he would have been eligible for a diversion program that would have helped him, maybe with different job skills, maybe getting a GED. And so there's so many more opportunities out there now for these entry-level cases that give me hope, that maybe we are starting to look at how do we address the recidivism? How do we help people make better decisions in their life so they don't have to continue on this conveyor belt to prison, parole, because that's not going to serve society.
Not at all. Well said. I absolutely love that. And I know someone listening it's resonating to be a part of that solution. And not only that, but even as I listen and we have this conversation, thinking of ways as leaders that we can be a part of that solution, whether it's making recommendations at the state, the local, the federal level for ways to, there's a rehabilitation involved that we can participate in. And it's a difficult, complicated question, but it's not impossible to help people illuminate a better future state when there are real options, and maybe they're not readily apparent. Maybe they're going to take work, but it's a better outcome for all society. That's the goal, right?
Exactly. I had a sentencing recently, and at a sentencing hearing, a victim's family can get up and make a victim impact statement to the judge. And this was a particular case where the defendant and victim knew one another. They were friends, and they had been playing with a gun, and the victim was killed by it. And the victim's uncle got up and made a really incredible victim impact statement. And said, when I was younger, made mistakes in my life, and I ended up going to prison. And I got out, and I was able to find people who would give me a job. And now he had a company. And he said to the defendant, when you get out of prison, you come look for me, and I will help you. And again, I was blown away, Nate, because again, I was thinking, okay, if this was my nephew, would I be able to be that grace and dignity? And it was such a powerful moment. But that is the kind of mentorship that we need for some of these young people. Yes. Because the reality is that it's not 50-year-olds that are doing these crimes. It's 17, 18, 19-year-olds. And they're getting out of prison at 30, 40. And we need to find some way to stop that conveyor belt because, again, society in general benefits from that.
Yeah.
And again, I'm still on the side of victims. There are some crimes that I believe a person should never be out of prison on because they are a threat to society. And there are some crimes that are so egregious that life without parole is appropriate. But there are other crimes where we have to think of alternatives in order for society to move forward. And it was interesting. I was at a service recently, and a minister said, and it had nothing to do with crime. It was just a father who died quite suddenly of natural causes. And I remember the minister looking at the deceased's young children, saying, the way that you paid tribute to your father is how you live your life now that he's gone. And I just thought that was really a powerful statement for really any of us. And I told the minister afterwards, I'm going to use your line. And I've used it, because family members will say to me, I don't know how I go on. I don't know how to move forward. And that resonated with me. We move forward. How we pay tribute to those that we love that have gone before us is how we live our lives after they're gone.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I didn't like to go to funerals for a long time, and I really didn't know what to say. And I learned over time, very similar statement, is that the best way to honor those who have passed on is to live fully. Because they would want us to.
Yes.
They don't get to. And even just this morning, I got a text from a friend, and one of our dear friends passed away, complications from a stroke. And just another reminder to live fully as an incredible way to honor those we love that have passed on. Man, I can't believe we've been talking for an hour or just thereabouts. And
I can't believe we have either.
I know, and we're just scratching the surface. There's so much to talk about in this area, but I know we've made some really good traction in the realms of forgiveness and choices and releasing and making decisions for ourselves, but all at the same time having being okay with grieving.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also being okay, as I say to so many family members, whether you're a child sexual abuse victim, whether you've just had your house burglarized, it is okay to be angry. That is a part of the grieving process. And because what we're grieving is the loss of the life we knew. One of the things that I always say to people is that when you're a crime victim, you want to go back to the way you were living the day before you were a crime victim. And that day's gone. Doesn't mean that the next day can't be wonderful. It doesn't mean that you're earmarked for a lifetime of sadness, but something has happened and now we shift and transition and move forward. And so it's about recognizing that it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be angry. It's how we express those emotions that sometimes get us into trouble, which again leads us back to what we talked about at the very beginning. Recognizing that I'm dealing with some powerful emotions and maybe I need help finding a way to express those in an appropriate way and move through them, and that's also what the goal is.
Yeah. Lisa, you're an ace. I love having you on the program. We've had great conversations, and I hope we get to continue on. Before you hop off, I do have one question for you.
Yes.
One day, you and I, everyone else, will be on that great summit, the end of the journey, if you will. And I'd like to ask you, as you think about that, what is it that you would like others to have said about you while you were on this journey?
Wow, Nate, that's a question that I've never been asked. That's a great question. I hope that what I leave with the people, whether it is professionally or the people in my life, is that they were heard. That when they needed me, I listened, I was there, I supported, and that they were heard. And also that I also made them laugh, because I just feel like in the midst of our pain and suffering, laughter, I know for me personally, has provided so much comfort, even in the midst of the worst situation possible, in order to find a little bit of humor and laughter, help me get over that hump. And so that's what I have always tried to reflect back to the people, whether it was professionally or personally, that I heard them, I accepted them for where they were, and that I, just was there to walk with them in their journey.
Well, you are well on your way, my friend.
Well, thank you so much.
So good having you.
Thank you very much. And please know these were just my personal opinions, not the opinions of anybody other than Lisa Jones.
Duly noted. We'll make sure it's included on the episode. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
That was awesome. Well, my friend, we did it again. I'm so glad you joined me on this episode of A Call to Leadership. If you've been with me on the show, listening in, you'll know this. But if you're new, you may not know that I created a free course for you that you don't need to provide an email address. You don't need to go anywhere, but to stay right here in the podcast. I created the very first 6 episodes of the podcast because I wanted you to have the kind of value that you need to take advantage of to thrive as a leader. So if you haven't done that yet, listen to episodes 1 through 6, and I'll see you on the next episode. I'm Dr. Nate Sala, and this is A Call to Leadership.